Chapter 23, the title is Politics in the Gilded Age. The first thing I need to do before we start chapter 23 is to talk about what is meant by the term Gilded Age. It was a term that was coined by Mark Twain in a book to describe this period post-Civil War up until about 1900. So say about 1868, all the way until 1900. Was a different period in American history filled with a lot of corruption, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment directed at big business, exploitation of workers, the rise and fall of labor unions and immigrants crowding the cities and driving down wages, and the fight between those who were against immigrants. So it was a time that was marked by a lot of disillusionment, anger, resentment, a lot of corruption, and a constant feel by the common man that they were getting pushed around by the rich and big business. So yeah, the period is known as the Gilded Age. So let's talk about the beginning of that time, 1868, the election of 1868. There's absolutely no way that Andrew Johnson was going to run again, nor would he have been nominated to run again by the Republican Party. So their standard bearer becomes the former Civil War hero, Ulysses S. Grant, many people crediting with the victory of the Civil War to this man. Really good soldier and won a lot of battles, but when it came to being a politician, not much in the way of experience, Grant. So, but that thought still prevailed at the time that if you could handle an army, that you can also handle the country, like a George Washington or Andrew Jackson. So yeah, Ulysses S. Grant is going to defeat a guy by the name of Seymour here. The Republican Party is still dominating politics at this point, because the Democrats are still on the outs when it comes to politics, because they were deemed a Southern party and most of the Democrats fled to the Confederacy and had not yet been welcomed back. The surprising thing was that Ulysses S. Grant pulled out a really close victory. A lot of people were questioning why it was so close. Only 300,000 victories, 300,000 votes separated the winner from the loser. And, and had it not been for African Americans getting the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, then Ulysses S. Grant quite possibly could have lost this election. So he owes the victory to African Americans. He won this by waving the bloody shirt. This is going to be a technique that is used by politicians for a really long time. All the way up until the early 1900s. What waving the bloody shirt meant was that the Republicans would use the Civil War and continually use that as evidence that the Democrats were the ones that caused the Civil War and caused the 600,000 deaths from that war. So they're going to blame the Democrats and continually campaign that it was their fault. Even 40, 50 years after the Civil War happened. So waving the bloody shirt becomes a Republican thing, and Grant used it to his benefit. So when we talk about Gilded Age, as I said, there were a lot of cheating, a lot of corruption going on, railroad companies cheating their customers, as we'll talk about. Judges and legislators put their power up for hire, meaning, that what that means is, they're willing to take money for their vote, willing to you can buy somebody's vote. So yeah, probably not great in politics for sure in a democracy. Tweed rings, basically boss rule or tweed rings that ran cities. And a great example of one, probably the best example of one, and why all of them were called Tweed rings, was a guy by the name of Tweed. His last name was Tweed. They called him Boss Tweed. He ran a ring in New York City. He was an elected official who would continually give money to immigrants former immigrants, now were American citizens that were able to vote, and he would give them money to vote and vote often. So if they could vote 20 times, Tweed would encourage that. And the more they voted, the more money they would most likely get. So it gave them incentive to go vote often for Tweed. And then Tweed would get reelected. These are called political machines. Another name for Tweed rings, boss rule, is political machines, because once they get going, you can't get rid of them. So an example of how he might do this is he might have a job that in the streets of New York need to be repaid. So he'd hire somebody who would charge the city double the amount. And then the city would then turn around and pay the person who did the work. And then that person would be required to give a kickback to Tweed. And a kickback would be he's kicking back, half the money. And then Tweed would pocket it, and then he'd go around and hand out money to immigrants who he'd have them vote 20 times over again. And once this thing got going, you could never get rid of a guy like that, because once they were elected, there was nothing they could do. And then they would continually get reelected. So political machines dominated cities like New York, and it just started to spread throughout the country. Chicago had big, political machines, and all big and medium-sized cities seemed to have them, and they had to be able to do something about it. But during the Gilded Age, they could do nothing about it. That's another one of the bad things that's happening during the Gilded Age. The term gilded means to be covered in a fine layer of gold. That's if something is gilded, rich people would do that. Like, say, baby's first shoes, they would gild it. They'd cover it in a fine layer of gold, and what's inside the gold that is not worth anything other than sentimental value, baby shoes. What is the outside has some, it looks good and has some value, but it's a thin layer of gold. So if something is gilded, it looks good from the outside, but not much to it on the inside. So that's why the term gilded was used. And Mark Twain used it and said, the United States looks good on the outside. Technology's at all-time high, cities are growing, big business is thriving, the Industrial Revolution has hit. From the outside, it looked like we're a growing world power. Upon further review, if you look closer, you saw all the corruption. You saw all the racial issues that were going on. You saw the political machines that were happening in these cities. So if something's gilded, it looks good on the outside, inside, not so good. So not a very good indicator of how the United States was at that time. Political cartoons became a big thing during this time. A guy by the name of Thomas Nast was the most well-known of the cartoonists, and this is one that was floated around. In fact, this is eventually how they're going to get rid of Tweed. They're gonna have enough of these political cartoons spread throughout the city that people started to understand who he was and what his motives were. And one thing you could do is you could show this to an immigrant. They could probably decipher the picture, but they may not be able to read the content of it because they read in a different language. But they could surely see, what the artist is trying to depict. And right here, it says here, in counting their strength, it says the ballot, and you've got Tweed there, always oversized, making money off the people. And here's another one here. It says here, that if you look at it, says New York and the Treasury and the courts, and he's like depicted as like a vulture. Tweed rings. So yeah, Thomas Nast is going to be who eventually helps bring down this man, as we'll talk about later. Grant was a guy who didn't have much political experience, so people took advantage of that. Politicians took advantage of it. Businesses took advantage of it. He was really good at commanding an army, and he was a good horseman. He was an expert when it comes to horses, quality of horses and whatnot. But when it came to judging people, not so good. Two well-known scandals that occurred: the whiskey ring, where millions of dollars were robbed from the Treasury, from the tax on whiskey. And then the money was spread around as hush money so people wouldn't talk. Grant didn't know about it, but when you're in a high political position like he was, president of the United States, he should have known about it. So he's guilty of not knowing what was going on. Same thing with the Credit Mobilier scandal. And the Credit Mobilier scandal was one of the biggest corruptions, basically political corruption that occurred during the entire 1800s, when a railroad company, the Union Pacific, created a false company called Credit Mobilier, and the Union Pacific was responsible for laying track from regard to the Transcontinental Railroad. They were laying track from east to west. So they were going over the Great Plains, and they were doing it at a really fast pace. The Central Pacific was laying railroad from California, and they were going eastward. So you had to go over the two mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains. And it was going to be very difficult, and it was going to be time consuming. And they were going, with half the speed of the Union Pacific. So the Union Pacific decided to take advantage of the situation and created a false company, called it Credit Mobilier. And they said these two companies were doing the work, and that's why they were going so fast. Well, the United States government paid Credit Mobilier and Union Pacific, so they doubled their pay. Huge scandal that occurred during Grant's administration, and no one really knew about it until after Grant was gone as president. But it was pretty bad, and the government was exposed because they didn't know about it. But once again, they should have known about it. A lot of corruption. In the election of 1872, the election happened before anybody knew anything about Credit Mobilier. And Grant goes against a newspaper man by the name of Horace Greeley, and Grant's going to win by a landslide. As close as the victory was before, it's not close this time. It's very wide range here when it comes to the electoral. When it comes to the electoral vote, Grant ended up winning 81% of the electoral vote. So he smashed Grant. It was a landslide victory for him. And interestingly enough, Greeley died in between the election and the electoral college vote within that 3-week period. So that's why you have the casting of votes for a bunch of different other people. So even if Greeley would have won, he wouldn't have been able to be president. In that case, the vice president, his vice presidential candidate would have become president, but it didn't happen. So there's NASC again with a cartoon that's supposed to be directed at Greeley, as Greeley is here on the left shaking hands with Tweed. It's a negative look at him. Okay, let's talk about the 1873 Depression. So in the middle of this Gilded Age, not only was there a lot of corruption and boss rule and things like that, but also had a really bad depression in 1873, and the money supply was in question. So a panic broke out caused by too many railroads and factories being formed. So they started laying railroad tracks everywhere, started building factories everywhere. Everybody was obsessed with railroads and obsessed with factories. But pretty soon they got to have too many factories and too many railroads, and the railroads weren't being used, and the factories were going out of business. And then you had a lot of high unemployment, and the banks were shutting down because they were loaning money to businesses that were failing. And the whole thing was going really, but the economy of the United States was in the toilet big time. So there was this demand from debtors. A debtor is anybody who owes any money. Farmers were debtors. People who owed a lot of money, like businesses that failed, were debtors. There was a push for the government to just cure this deflation that was happening, right? Because there wasn't enough money going around because people were unemployed. So deflation was hitting. And that was hurting businesses, and it was really contributing to even making the depression even worse, because more businesses were going out of business because their deflation was hitting, their product prices were going down, and they weren't making a profit anymore. So they would go out of business, contributing to more unemployment, contributing to less people buying. And next thing you know, the price for goods is going down. We don't even hear about deflation now. The big thing for us is inflation, not deflation. but we've kind of fixed that. But at this time, you could see why. People didn't have money in their pockets, and no one's going out buying anything. So in order to sell, you had to lower the price. That's deflation. So debtors say there's an easy cure to deflation. Print out more money. Just print more money and have, programs that you can get money to farmers who need it, people who are debtors. You can, so if you have more money, obviously the price is going to go up. Right. A classic example of that is Germany after World War I, when they did exactly that. They just started printing out more money and the price for goods just skyrocketed. And for you to go buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store, you had to bring a wheelbarrow full of money. And the wheelbarrow was worth a lot more than that whole wheelbarrow full of money. So that's inflation. So debtors are saying, well, let's create that inflation. Let's print more money so inflation will happen. But that's really hard to control. How much is too much? When if you printed too much, that inflation would be uncontrolled. It's really, really risky to do that. So there was kind of this compromise. Is the idea started to be floating around out there? Why not coin silver? Why not go out and take silver that's not a greenback? A greenback is just a piece of paper. It's not worth anything. If you coin silver, you actually have something of value. You make a silver dollar that would look something like this through the Bland-Allison Act that I'll talk about in a second. And there's 50 cents worth of silver in each one of those dollars, but they're calling it a dollar. So there's promoting a little bit of inflation there. 50 cents worth of silver. It's not worth nothing. If you just hand them a greenback, a dollar bill, it's actually just paper and it has no value. Our dollars have value because the United States government says it has value and we have a stable government. So we're okay with that. Now, these silver dollars that they were compromising on has 50 cents worth of silver in it. So it has some value. So they started floating that idea, just make more silver dollars. So the Bland-Allison Act was passed. The conservatives, the business owners, are not on board with creating inflation. That is way too risky for them. They're conservative and they don't want that to happen. So the Bland-Allison Act was passed as a compromise. They instructed the Treasury to buy and coin between $2 and $4 million each month of silver. $2 and $4 million a month in silver to you and I sounds like a lot, but when you think about the entire country, it's a drop in the bucket. It was toe dipping is what it was. They were just testing the waters to see if they could possibly make this happen. But again, business people were not on board with the Bland-Allison Act of 1878. The farmers and debtors were like, we need more silver. Free and unlimited coin. Let's have tons of coins. Let's make coins. Let's stimulate the economy with this. Why not? Businesses are like, no, because then inflation is going to hit and it's going to be worse than deflation. So you have this fight going on between the common man that wants inflation and the rich and the big businesses that don't want that. Virginia City in Nevada was where they mined a lot of silver to use for Bland-Allison and other acts that were passed later on. The Comstock Lode, it was called, Virginia City, near close to Reno. Here's some information on the Gilded Age. A couple things here. The role of women was being challenged during this time. Industrialists and corporations, utilities, bankers, brokers were increasingly viewed as an enemy by the working class. Wages had stagnated, and the rich got richer. Failed land deals, speculation, corruption. That pretty much sums up the Gilded Age. And that's, as Mark Twain coined it in his book called The Gilded Age. So that has stuck, that name, to define this period, Gilded Age. Looks good on the outside, not so good on the inside. It was an age of tiptoe politics, right? You have a bunch of no-name presidents that we're going to be talking about that you may have never heard of. Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland are some examples of Gilded Age presidents. Benjamin Harrison. that you probably have never heard of, because presidents during this time were weak. Elections were close, and generally speaking, when elections are close, the candidates or the new president will usually be weak. If someone wins by a landslide, they have a lot more support. It all depends on, their power with Congress and whatnot. But yeah, because the presidents were weak during the Gilded Age, they didn't do much, and there was just not that big of a difference between Democrats and Republicans. And both parties were strong. People were actually going out and voting, but it's a period where the elections were so close that the presidents were weak, and that's why you've never heard of those presidents. There's very few people that, if you ask them anything about Chester Arthur's presidency, would be able to tell you one thing about it. You guys will be able to, but most people do not know about that. Okay, so let's talk about the election of 1876, probably one of the most controversial elections in history. In the election of 2020, they continually brought this election up. They talked about it a lot because there was actually some disputed ballots that were turned in, and it was a controversy, one of the biggest controversies. 2020 was one of the biggest controversial elections since 1876. And again, it was brought up numerous times. So the Democrats nominate Samuel Tilden, who was a lawyer who helped bring down the Tweed Ring with the help of Thomas Nast and his political cartoons. The Republicans nominated a man by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was kind of a compromise candidate between the two different factions of the Republican Party. But anyways, he's the candidate in 1876. So here's the problem, and here's where it was disputed. And we can very close connections with the 2020 election. Tilden was just about to win this election. He had 180 votes, and all you needed was 185 to be declared the winner. So yeah, that was a majority at the time. Like today, it's 270 because we have more states. The minute that a candidate wins 270 electoral votes today, it's declared the winner. Back then, it was when the candidate reached 185, you're declared the winner. But there were 4 states whose votes were disputable: Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon. The 3 southern states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, all 3 of them are former Confederate states. And they sent in 2 sets of returns, one from the military that was in the streets because of Reconstruction, and one from the whites who started voting again, the old whites that lived there that now were starting to be able to vote again. And Oregon was just a new state, and there was a lot of confusion there. So there was a dispute. Now, all Tilden would have had to win he would have had to win one of these states. He needs one single electoral vote. And we know it's winner take all in all 4 of those states. So he just needs one of those states to be declared the winner. And Tilden's a Democrat. So for sure, if you take the whites' votes in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, he's going to win by a landslide. If you take the military's votes, then he's going to lose. So there was so much controversy at the time, and because of the 2 sets of returns. So what they did is they said, we're going to create an electoral commission. And there was talk about there being an electoral commission in the 2020 election as this was precedent of something they've done before. It didn't happen. The Electoral Count Act passed in 1877, which set up an electoral commission, and they tried to make it fair. There were going to be 8 Republicans, and there were going to be 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats from Congress, and then 1 Supreme Court justice who was neither Democrat or Republican. He was neutral. So they were going to try to make it try to make it as fair as they possibly could, and it was going to be up to the Supreme Court justice to decide if the votes were going to go to Tilden or were going to go to Hayes. Well, it's the Gilded Age, and he resigned, the justice from the Supreme Court, probably under pressure. And then the rest of the members of the Supreme Court were all Republicans because the Democrats seceded with the Confederacy. So you had a Republican come in, and no surprise, the vote count was 8-7 to give the votes to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. But they had to come up with a compromise. And the compromise was very consequential for history of the United States, and we still feel the effects of this compromise today. The Compromise of 1877 stated this: one, Republican Hayes would become president of the United States. Two, the Republicans agreed to remove all troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. There were still military in the streets in a lot of these states, but as a gesture of compromise here, the Republican says, if we get our president, then we will take our troops out of the South. The creation of the Southern Transcontinental Railroad, right? That would be, we talked about one going from New Orleans to Los Angeles. That's going to happen. The Republicans abandoned their commitment to civil rights. Here is the biggest contentious issue from the Compromise of 1877 is the Republicans said, okay, we will not go down and interfere with the civil rights issues in the South. You can handle it yourselves. Well, you know how that's going to go over. The Southern former Confederate states are going to treat African Americans terribly. They're going to start lynching African Americans again. It's going to be the rise of black codes, which becomes Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. Segregation is happening in the South. And then the last thing, the Southerners would receive patronage, which is jobs in the Hayes cabinet. So Hayes had a lot of Southerners in his cabinet. So there's a compromise of 1877. It effectively ends Reconstruction. That's the year it stops officially. But the big thing is the Republicans abandoned their commitment to civil rights. So they turned their back on African Americans to get their president. And he ends up being a pretty mediocre president. So there's the outcome of the election and the Hayes victory. And, so here's a political cartoon, the guy with a whip and a gun, and it's a Democrat. And it says Tilden or blood. And it basically saying that they got blood. They didn't get their president, but they got blood. They got what they wanted. The South got what they wanted, in that Reconstruction was over and the whites were going to be voting again, and the Republicans were going to not interfere with civil rights. So again, they turned their back on African Americans. So the end of the Republican crusade for civil rights is going to result in this: physical harm to African Americans, the rise of the KKK, the uncontrolled rise of the KKK in the South. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll tax are all ways to keep African Americans from the polls. They couldn't vote, even though they've been allowed to vote through the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. They would make them take a literacy test, and if they could pass a literacy test, they'd make them pay a poll tax, and if they could pay the poll tax, they'd say they'd pull the grandfather clause deal. They'd say, "Did your grandfather vote in the 1860 election?" And of course, no African Americans voted in the 1860 presidential election, so that would keep them from the polls. So they illegally, unconstitutionally kept African Americans from the polls. The rise of sharecropping, cropland, and tenant farming, all ways to keep African Americans down financially. Jim Crow laws, separate but equal facilities, and lynchings. So you started to see this all throughout the South: burning crosses and literacy tests, and you see segregation, and there's a man being lynched in front of the polls, and Republicans are gone because they said as long as they get their president, they could do what they want. And the separate but equal facilities was allowed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States in 1896 ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate was okay as long as separate was equal. And they never equal, meaning you could have, say, restrooms for African Americans and for whites, but as long as they were equal, you were allowed to have that. And that never happened. And that's not the point, right? Is people were upset with this because it's racism. It's institutional racism is what it is. This was not overturned until 1954. Part of it was overturned with Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which is something that we'll get into later in the year. But this was on the books from the 1890s all the way to 1954, that separate was okay as long as separate was equal. Plessy versus Ferguson is the court case. There were class conflicts everywhere during the Gilded Age. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, so strikes everywhere, and deaths, because of the violence that happened because of strikes. Over 100 people died because of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which spread throughout 4 or 5 states. The railroads were cutting people's wages and they were going on strike. President Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, became the first president to send the troops in on the striking workers, setting in just a precedent that the common man hated, and that government sided with the money, sided with big business. So sending in these troops against the striking workers in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 set a bad precedent. So yeah, and then all this resentment between the Chinese, between the Irish, was happening all over the country, and it's doing that again. And now the Irish are actually turning on the Chinese, and it's going to lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act that's passed, and it's going to ban Chinese from coming into this country for 40 years. Long time. And that's the end of part 1.